Have you ever thought that a tiny button on your shirt silently steered some of the greatest transformations in human history? This small circle, seemingly insignificant at first glance, is actually a hidden architect that determined how societies dressed, how they were categorized, how they displayed power, and even how they established order. You might think of the button as an ordinary fastener, yet its journey, from ancient seashells to the gold embroideries of imperial palaces, from military uniforms to modern technological designs, reveals a profound story woven into the very fabric of civilization. Now, we pull back the curtain to discover how this humble invention, which remained virtually invisible throughout thousands of years of history, fastened, shaped, and sustained human societies. Looking at the earliest periods of human history, the button did not yet exist as an object, but the need to bind was one of the earliest reflexes of human existence, both biological and cultural. Protection from the cold, ease of movement during the hunt, shielding the body from external threats, and showing belonging within a community. All these aims led humans to bind, fasten, and cover things even before the concept of tailoring was born. Archaeological findings show us that seashells used as ornamentation, pierced stone pieces, animal bones, and even carved small ivory discs were the direct ancestors of today's button. Their first function was not connection, it was indication. They represented tribal belonging, hunting success, a belief ritual, and also served as a sign of the person's identity. These small objects, like tattoos and paints, were the early answers to the question, "Who am I?" within society. Over time, practical needs merged with symbolic value. Piercing shells and bone fragments, tying them with ropes, and adding them to clothes formed the category of functional adornment. It was in this period that the button's origin, without even a name, emerged as a cultural blend. Ornamentation and function, aesthetics and security began to intertwine. But the truly transformative idea had not yet emerged. Until one day, an unknown artisan, a tribal master, perhaps a mother, decided to combine a hole with a loop. This small decision gave birth to one of the simplest yet most revolutionary inventions in human history. This is how the story of the button begins. An act of binding born out of necessity, an adornment fueled by identity, and finally, the moment the hole met the buttonhole. Once the button-buttonhole combination emerged, humanity crossed a crucial threshold. Now, the idea of closing something became not just a cover, but a system. From this point on, the button transformed into both a mechanism controlling physics and a symbol reinforcing social order. The oldest true buttons appeared in excavations in the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Central Asia. These buttons were not only functional, but also part of a social language. The material of a button, bone, stone, bronze, mother of pearl, determined the person's status. The shape of a button, round, oval, geometric, reflected tribal or communal identity. The motif on a button, sun, animal, plant, narrated the person's belief system. This meant the button entered the stage of history not merely as a fastener, but as a component of identity. For early societies, a button functioned like the cover of a book. Small but information-bearing, invisible but decisive, silent but social. The button was no longer just holding the garment together. It represented an invisible language that regulated human communities. And most importantly, this new mechanism was the first link in a giant chain of transformation that would later extend from tailoring to war strategies. The combination of a hole with a loop, perhaps it seems ordinary today, but this union is one of the most efficient simplicities in human history. Like the wheel, the nail, the scissors, or the lock, the buttonhole principle is perfect proof of how a small idea can influence civilizations. Thanks to this invention, humans could, for the first time, shape their clothing according to their body, manage their movement more comfortably, protect themselves more effectively against cold and wind, adjust their clothes to be fully closed or semi-closed, make their social status visible, adorn their rituals with specific symbols. But the real revolution occurred with the birth of fashion through the buttonhole system. Because this mechanism enabled the development of tailoring techniques appropriate for the human body. Stitching, cutting, shaping, and silhouette design were only made possible by the button. This means that the union of a small hole and a small loop enabled the human body to be truly dressed for the first time in history. The button thus became an invention that shaped not only the garment, but also physical culture, social order, aesthetic understanding, and societal norms. During the Middle Ages and early modern period, the button ascended far beyond the mere function of a fastener. In these eras, the button became one of the most visible indicators of power for aristocrats, noble families, and court circles. Clothing itself no longer served only for protection or covering. It functioned as a stage for social identity. Especially in European courts, buttons were cast from gold and silver alloys and adorned with mother-of-pearl, coral, ivory, and even precious stones. The sheer number of buttons used on a garment became a direct measure of a person's status. It was not uncommon for a nobleman's jacket to feature dozens of embroidered buttons. This was a declaration of both wealth and social standing. Buttons did not only carry material value, they also bore political and cultural symbols, heraldic crests, signs of orders, religious motifs, and military rank-like embroideries. All these symbols transformed into a silent manifesto on the front of a garment. This period was the most glorious stage for the button in fashion history. And on this stage, the button was not just an adornment, but a concrete sign of power, prestige, and privilege. The button's true revolution occurred not just in aesthetics, but in the adaptation of the body to the garment. Fabrics with operable buttonholes, thanks to the button, fundamentally changed the interaction of the human body with clothing. This was the first time in human history that clothing could hug the body, control movement, determine form, reflect social roles. The influence of the button on the art of tailoring triggered two major transformations. Structured clothing, garments like doublets, jackets, and trousers gained a specific form thanks to the button. The fabric was no longer just a surface covering the body, but an architectural structure belonging to the body. Silhouette. Revolution. Men's clothing gained more defined lines, and women's clothing acquired more dramatic contours. Aesthetic clothing was, for the first time, a designable element thanks to the button. The button did not just partition the fabric, it enabled the transformation of the body into a vehicle of social expression by joining these pieces together. Thus, the language of clothing became more complex and meaningful due to the button. The button thereby became one of the invisible but most effective engineers of fashion history. The history of buttons is not only the history of material culture, but also the history of an invisible communication system. Which side a button was sewn on, at what height it was positioned, how many were used, and even at what intervals they were placed, all carried specific meanings for centuries. Gender codes. The fact that men's shirt buttons are on the right and women's on the left hides a complex history related to class, servant culture, and societal roles. Rank and affiliation. In military uniforms, the number, arrangement, and motifs of buttons determine rank. The button is like a small seal, silently proclaiming a commander's identity. Political and ideological reference. In certain periods, button placement became a symbol of adherence to a group's ideals. Some button configurations produced cultural references so strong that closed buttons meant obedience, and open ones meant rebellion. Secret messages and symbolic orders, encrypted button arrangements were used by spies and secret societies in the 18th and 19th centuries. The buttons on the front of a jacket were sometimes the encrypted map of a message. The language of buttons is invisible, yet it carries the clues of the social structure. Despite being a small object, the button has silently fastened humanity's systems of status, power, belonging, and communication. The Industrial Revolution did not just create steam power, mechanical production, and new social classes. It fundamentally changed the fate of buttons, once carved individually by artisans. This period is the age where the button's small but effective identity spread to the masses. Mechanization transformed the button in several key ways. Mass production. Buttons were no longer the product of a few artisans, but of a giant industry. Hundreds of buttons could be produced, and their sizes standardized within minutes. Affordable access. The button ceased to be the symbolic jewel of the aristocracy and became a common object found on everyone's clothing. Ordinary people could, for the first time, access the aesthetic codes belonging to society's upper classes. New materials, thanks to steam power and mass production, pressed wood, bone powder mixtures, metal alloys, and later, early plastics, began to be used in button production. The birth of modern identity. The widespread adoption of this small object formed the cornerstone of ready-to-wear culture. Clothing was now the product of industry, not just the tailor. The Industrial Revolution did not just cheapen the button, it turned it into an invisible yet central mechanism of the modern world. This mass-produced element, integrated into the pocket, sleeve, shoulder, and collar of every individual, became one of the smallest yet most effective details defining the rhythm of the ever-growing cities. The spread of mass production fundamentally changed the core dynamic of fashion. The buttons on a garment were no longer just functional. They carried a promise of style. The late 19th century brought the rise of ready-to-wear. Patterns were standardized, models proliferated, and clothes were now sold in series. The unseen hero of this change was the button. The button played three critical roles during this period. Expansion of fashion. Access. The magnificent buttons once accessible only to nobles in ancient times began to appear on the jackets of urban workers. Aesthetics spread to all classes of society. Acceleration of dressing. Thanks to the button, dressing and undressing became faster, easier, and more functional. Slow methods like tying fabric, pinning, or using brooches gave way to the practicality of the button. Style unifier buttons became a visual and structural signature, defining the identity of ready-to-wear. Brands developed their own button styles, establishing identity. With this era, the button became the most effective tool for the democratization of fashion. It was produced for everyone, used by everyone, and added an expression to everyone's appearance. The buttonhole, as much as the button itself, is the unseen hero of clothing history. Often overlooked, the buttonhole, this small detail that appears to be a simple opening, becomes one of the fundamental elements that determine the rhythm of modern clothing, together with the button. First buttonholes, leather and linen. The earliest buttonholes were created by piercing crude fabric or cutting leather. This basic technique allowed the button to be securely placed on the garment. A technical revolution in tailoring. The development of the art of buttonhole making created stronger stitches and more aesthetic openings. Now, the button was not only fastening the garment, it was determining the garment's form and movement. Differentiating buttonholes in men's and women's clothing. Like the language of the button, the direction of the buttonholes also became a part of societal norms. Clothing culture, body language, and class roles were silently hidden in the placement of buttonholes. The rise of design variety, round, teardrop, square, double row, narrow. Buttonholes created their own aesthetic vocabulary in the world of design. The buttonhole is the complement of the button. It is the structural backbone that makes room for the button, carries it, and makes it visible. This is why, behind the scenes of clothing history, there is a hero as silent but as effective as the buttonhole. Developments in material science in the 20th century transformed the button's identity once again. The button was no longer made only from natural materials. It was becoming a symbol of the synthetic world designed by human hands. This century witnessed three major material revolutions for the button. The plastic revolution. Bakelite and other early plastic types paved the way for cheap, durable, and easily moldable buttons. Plastic became an indispensable part of the fashion and ready-to-wear industry worldwide. Metal alloys. From stainless steel to aluminum, brass to lightweight alloys, many materials offered an aesthetic that prioritized durability. Military uniforms, work clothes, and accessories were reinforced with these materials. The rise of minimalist design, post-industrial design philosophy, simplified the aesthetic role of the button. To emphasize the silhouette, buttons were made more minimal and functional. The modern button is now a functional, aesthetic, and technological entity. It is a silent architectural piece that disappears into the clothing, but forms the backbone of clothing culture. The meeting of textile technology with the digital age transformed the button from merely a physical fastener into a smart component. Today, the button maintains its traditional form while simultaneously opening a door to the electronic world. Modern smart buttons are equipped with sensors. Microsensors capable of collecting data like heart rate, step count, body temperature, or posture can now be integrated into the button form. Provide data communication. Thanks to Bluetooth or near-field communication, NFC, the smart button can connect with phones, watches, and other devices to transmit data. Are used for security and identity. Verification. Some smart buttons contain user-specific identification information, providing access control in work environments or private areas. The button, for the first time, began to carry not just the garment, but the digital face of identity. Determine the future of functional design. A button can now light up, provide alerts through vibration, send emergency signals, or process health data. This transformation is one of the quietest yet most powerful role changes in the button's history. A button that carried tribal identity 1,000 years ago is today becoming the gateway to digital identity. The button is an important part of not only clothing history, but also cultural memory. In fashion, cinema, painting, and the world of collecting, the button carries meaning, aesthetics, and nostalgia. Buttons, iconized in the fashion world, Chanel's gold-plated buttons, the double-row button arrangement of military jackets, the large buttons of retro coats. Fashion designers have turned the button into a storytelling tool. Symbolic uses in cinema. In character design, the button sometimes represents innocence, sometimes authority, and sometimes eccentricity. From stop-motion films to period dramas, the button is a small but effective detail that defines characters' identity. Collecting and history enthusiasts. Old Navy buttons, imperial buttons, court craftsmanship products, and even machine-pressed buttons from the Industrial Revolution are highly sought after by collectors today. Each button is like a sociological document of its era. The button thus ceases to be merely a piece of clothing. It transforms into a miniature carrier of culture, memory, and aesthetic heritage. The button is one of the smallest yet most effective inventions in human history. At a glance, an ordinary, simple circle turned by a fingertip. But in reality, a button plays a much larger role in the invisible architecture of society. This small mechanism has, over centuries, transformed military uniforms into the visible face of discipline, made professional attire a symbol of seriousness, determined gender-based clothing distinctions, shaped the aesthetic codes of fashion trends, both concealed and revealed class differences, silently accompanied modern humanity's search for order, arrangement, control. The button did not directly change human behavior, but it guided the way humans presented themselves, their relationship with the world, and their social roles with surprising consistency. Throughout history, the button has been both a gateway providing privacy and a small sign of the boundaries humans draw for themselves. Closing a button means closing, protecting, ordering. Opening a button means liberating, moving, expressing oneself. Today, the future of the button in the modern world is evolving in two main directions. On one side, the timelessness of the traditional button. Classic design is still indispensable. This small object represents a functionality that has not changed for hundreds of years. On the other side, technological transformation, smart buttons, sustainable materials, and new forms integrated with wearable technology carry the button's future into the digital world. The button no longer just holds fabric together. It is becoming a small intersection point that connects the past to the present, the individual to society, and culture to the future. This is why the history of the button is one of the most humble yet continuous narratives of human history. And this long journey reminds us, the button, though seemingly ordinary, is one of the silent engineers of civilization. Sometimes it was the symbol of discipline on a soldier's uniform. Sometimes it transformed into a subtle expression of aesthetics in a tailor's hand. And sometimes it appears as a smart component within modern technology. The trace of a button sometimes appears on the gold-embroidered clothes of palaces, sometimes on a worker's worn jacket, and sometimes on a child's school uniform. Each one performs the same function: to fasten order. Perhaps we don't notice it today. Perhaps we are accustomed to its presence. But the button is one of the smallest yet most reliable common denominators of human history. It holds the past, regulates the present, and carries the future. This is why every touch of a button is, in fact, a touch upon an ancient part of the human story.